thank you very much for the very warm welcome. And before I start talking, I would like to refer to the slide at the back, and that outlines the Krasno event series, which I'm running at UNC. And that's an event series where we invite interesting speakers, diplomats, economists, business people, journalists, or the military, all sorts of people to come and talk to us. The next event is actually coming Thursday. But if you wish to be put on our mailing list, then go to the website, krasnoevents.com. There is a form, and you can fill in that form and just send it to me. Or you can email me to my personal email, which is also on the slide. And then I will put you manually onto the mailing list. That might actually be the easiest, but it's up to you. But if any one of you has interest in being on the mailing list to get information about this exciting speaker series, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. And you have still got the chance to note down the information on the slide, because I now want to, hold on, no, that is wrong. Let me get to a better background, which I think looks a bit nicer, doesn't it? Right, and it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I would like to talk about, as you know, the 2020 presidential election and the future of US-Chinese relations. And I want to make 3 points. First of all, I want to talk briefly about the presidential election. Then I would like to talk briefly about what it means for US foreign policy in general, depending on who wins. And then I would like to focus on the future of American-Chinese relations, which is, of course, highly important. So let me first turn to the presidential election as such. And as you will all know, that at the moment, Joe Biden, the former vice president, is in the lead with more or less 7-8%. But his advantage seems to be a little shrinking. So we don't know what the outcome will be. And I think, in my personal belief, what will be decisive, unless there is some sudden scandal erupting both in the Biden camp or in the Trump camp, but if that isn't the case, what will be important will be the debates. The first one will be on Tuesday, as you know. Then there will be 2 more debates and 1 vice presidential debate. I think that could well swing the election depending on who clearly wins, who is seen as tired and weak, and who is seen as dynamic and energetic and having the best arguments. Secondly, and I think the debates are important, I'm sure all of us will actually watch them. Secondly, I think what is a so-called October surprise may be also decisive. And here, of course, we all remember the 2016 election, when only 2 weeks, something like 2 weeks before the election, the then CIA chief Comey announced that he would start reinvestigating Hillary Clinton. And that had a decisive impact on the outcome of the election in 2016. Particularly people in swing states were suddenly having more doubts about Hillary Clinton as a presidential candidate, and at the last minute may have voted for Trump instead of, as they originally intended, for Hillary Clinton. And of course, both camps, both the Biden camp and the Trump camp, expect another October surprise. And perhaps one October surprise was already today, when the New York Times reported that they had President Trump's tax returns for the last 20 years. I've only looked at the article very briefly. I really don't know if any really bombshells are in that article, in that announcement, but that could be influential. But above all, what is expected, and Trump very much hopes for that perhaps there is the announcement of a vaccine. If that came in late October or even on the 1st of November, he would, of course, try to turn that to his advantage, and maybe that would swing voters to vote for him. Then anything about information about a tax cut, a dramatic new tax cut that might influence voters, and of course also getting his Supreme Court nominee through just before the election, maybe in late October, that might also count as a October surprise and might swing voters to vote for him. And of course, there could also be a foreign policy surprise. And what analysts think is perhaps a military conflict would rally the American voters behind the flag, behind President Trump. That is, as you know, what we can often see when there is a war, when there is military conflict, particularly in the first few days, the first few weeks, then the American voters and the American people rally behind the president, whoever that president is. You know, a sense of patriotism, a sense of loyalty, a sense of nationalism, then influences the American voters. And so analysts wonder whether Trump may be interested in unleashing a military conflict. And what comes to mind is, of course, conflict in the South China Sea with China. As you know, China is the bogeyman of this election. What used to be during the Cold War, what used to be the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was seen as a big evil, now, at least temporarily, we hope, but still at the moment, China seems to be the big bogeyman of this election. So a military conflict, even a short temporary conflict in the South China Sea, that, of course, might rally the American people behind President Trump. So there is fear in the Biden camp, for example, that the Trump administration may look for an excuse to find such a military opportunity. Of course, this is all speculation. We don't know about it. Personally, of course, I very much hope that no military conflict will take place, neither in the South China Sea nor anywhere else in the world, be it Syria, Afghanistan, or anywhere else, but you never know. So we are in for a surprise, perhaps. The last few weeks of the election campaign will not only show these very exciting debates, but they may also show us some very unwelcome surprises, be it in domestic politics, be it perhaps in foreign policy and military confrontation. It's impossible to know. Secondly, that leads me to my second point. Is it really important who wins the election? In the past, we usually say, well, they are not all that different from each other. You know, one president is a little bit more to the left, is a little bit more to the right, but essentially they follow the same sort of traditional American foreign policy and also domestic policy. Perhaps the differences are larger in domestic policy usually than in foreign policy. And I think until recently, that was true. But already when you go back to the year 2000, when George W. Bush won against Al Gore, narrowly, as you know, it was quite a confrontational election campaign, a very controversial outcome of the election. In the end, the Supreme Court came out in favor of George W. Bush. But we know that President Al Gore would not have invaded Iraq. He probably would have gone against Afghanistan after 9/11 as well. Probably any president would have had to do that to get to the Taliban. But the invasion of Iraq and President Al Gore would probably not have done. George W. Bush, as we all know, did so. And it is a conflict which essentially is still going on. A terrible conflict, has cost the United States an awful lot of money, but also, of course, an awful lot of lives, both American lives and even more Iraqi lives. So that did make a huge difference, the outcome of that election in 2000. And I think something similar is at play today. We don't know whether it will refer to military policy, but I think the two presidential candidates are very different indeed, and also in foreign policy matters, not just in domestic politics, perhaps regarding economic or tax policy, but also in foreign policy. Let me just make 3 points about that. Regarding foreign policy, Biden and Trump differ in 3 points. Regarding A, US global leadership, B, what I would call cooperation and alliances, and also democracy. Regarding global leadership, I would just want to give you one example. That is climate change and environmental leadership. We know all, I think we're all familiar, that President Trump doesn't believe in climate change. Or he doesn't believe that that humans are responsible for climate change. He believes it's just natural phases. It comes and goes. Sometimes we have more hurricanes than in other years. And, you know, that is nature. And Biden, of course, believes very much that climate change and environmental pollution It's largely and overwhelmingly caused by human beings, including by Americans. You may know that 15% of all environmental pollution in the world is contributed by the United States. Being a big industrialized nation, 15%. The United States only has something like 4% of the global population, but it contributes 15% of environmental pollution. President Biden would probably attack that much more strongly than would a President Trump, who simply doesn't believe that it is caused by human people, by human beings. And that, of course, also means if you, as president, attack climate change and start in your own country by doing something about it, by raising, let's say, environmental standards, you have a much better leadership role and model role regarding the rest of the world. So then you can go to other countries like China, who is also a huge polluter, or the European industrialized nations. They are also huge polluters. You can go to them and say, you see, we are doing an awful lot ourselves. Now you please follow our example. We are not just talking. We are not just pretending that we believe in it. We are actually doing something on the ground in our own country. And that would give the climate change leadership of the United States a much stronger persuasive quality than if you just don't do anything and only remind other countries to do something. You know, it's all very well to attack the coal polluting industries in China and the coal power stations in China, which are very dirty, clearly. But it is much better if you say, I first do something in my own country, and then I also ask you, China, to do something about your coal power stations. If you only tell the Chinese, please do something about your own coal power stations, but you don't do anything in your own countries, that of course weakens the argument. So I think global leadership regarding climate change is highly dependent on the outcome of the election, whether it will be Biden or Trump. Secondly, that leads me to my second point in this rubric, that is cooperation with allies. And here I think the Trump administration has shown a huge neglect, which has been unique for an American president. When you go back in history, certainly since 1945, all Democratic, all Republican presidents were strongly supportive of their European and Asian allies, because they all realized the United States is a much stronger country by cooperating with other countries. And most American presidents before Trump also actively cooperated not just with allies, but also with rivals and foes. During the Cold War, in the 1970s, 1980s, there was strong cooperation with the Soviet Union. You remember the arms negotiation deals done between Reagan and Gorbachev, which led to real differences in the arms race. That was done because there was a strong cooperation with rivals. But during the same time, the United States also actively cooperated very much so with the European allies, with the European Economic Community, with NATO countries, and also with, for example, South Korea and Japan. And we don't see that under a Trump administration. Whatever you may think about whether Trump's foreign policy is successful, is reasonable, is sensible, I think everyone agrees, and here both Democratic and Republican analysts, both Fox News and CNN, largely agree that Trump does not seem to have much of an interest in America's allies. He kind of bullies South Korea and Japan to pay more for the basing of American troops in these countries, for American bases. He has even threatened to withdraw the United States from NATO. And as you also know, he has left many international organizations like the World Health Organization, like the Iran deal, of course, and he has threatened to undermine and leave NATO. So I think that will be very different under a Biden presidency. If Trump wins, we can probably see more of the same regarding non-cooperation with both allies and also America's rivals and foes. If Biden wins, I think we will probably go back to a more constructive, at least the attempt to constructively cooperate with many other countries around the globe. So that will make a huge difference depending on whether Biden or Trump wins. And that brings me to the third point in this rubric, that is democracy. And here again, people are worried about President Trump's love or sympathy for the strong man in the world. And that is, I mean, with these people, I mean, really autocrats and dictators, like now in Russia, Vladimir Putin, who is not a dictator, but certainly an autocrat, or with the Turkish leader Erdogan, and above all with that young crown prince in Saudi Arabia, a very kind of dubious politician, Mohammed bin Salman, where Trump has clearly been impressed by bin Salman. At the same time, he is openly criticizing democratic leaders like Angela Merkel in Germany. And you wonder, why would he not like Angela Merkel, a long-standing Democrat with very great democratic credentials, but he is impressed by Erdogan and bin Salman in Saudi Arabia? This is strange. And that is unusual regarding an American president. So and I think with that sort of sympathy for strongmen, it also means that American support for democracy abroad is not as strong as it used to be. Trump also has expressed sympathy, has met with the leaders of Hungary and Poland, who have turned in the meantime into autocratic leaders. They are members of the European Union, but even the European Union has criticized them strongly and has warned that these countries are being turned into autocratic countries. They're not really democracies anymore. Trump is still criticizing Angela Merkel, he's criticizing French President Macron, but he has expressed great understanding and sympathy for the leaders of Hungary and Poland. And that is unique for an American president. In the past, both Republican and Democratic presidents would always be on the side of democratic leaders and be critical towards autocratic leaders. With Trump, that has been reversed. And that, of course, undermines America's support for democracy worldwide. How can America go around and criticize Putin, criticize Xi Jinping, and remind them that they should really hold up democracy when he's not really interested in holding up and supporting democratic leaders himself? This, of course, undermines what you say in public. And this, I believe, is not good for the United States. And above all, it is not good for world affairs. And that brings me to my third point, and perhaps the most important point, that is the future of American-Chinese relations after this election. As I said at the beginning, unfortunately, China has become the bogeyman of this election. Everyone now turns around and says China is evil, China is bad, and something needs to be done about it. That is, in my view, both correct and wrong. And first of all, the question which also is on everyone's mind, is war likely? And of course, we all, when we think of superpower conflict, then we remind ourselves of the Cold War, the conflict with the Soviet Union, and we remind ourselves of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And during that crisis, it almost came to a war between the Soviet Union and the United States. That war, as we all know, would have wiped out most of the world, most of both Soviet and American people. We possibly would not be sitting here on Zoom if there had been a war over Cuba in 1962, because the radiation fallout, the consequences of that would probably still be with us. There have been other accidents which, during the Cold War, which only narrowly avoided war between the Soviet Union and the United States. So we have all been extremely lucky. Of course, it is our absolutely utmost task for now, for the post-Cold War period, to avoid any possibility that there might be a major war between the great powers or even a nuclear war between the great powers. But the question is increasingly asked because we see the escalating conflict between China and the United States. Is war just round the corner? And what people interestingly always compare it with is the German situation in the 19th century. In the late 19th century, Germany was a rising power. Germany wanted to be a global power, and it took on the then leading power of the day, which was the British Empire, competed with the British Empire, but the end result was the terrible First World War of 1914 to 1918. And that memory, of course, does not inspire much confidence. You know, if in earlier days, great powers clashed and then it led to a huge war, maybe now the US and China clashing, will that lead to another huge war? And I have to be optimistic here. I don't think that will be the case. I cannot see that neither American leaders or Chinese leaders will be so irresponsible to gradually move toward the war situation. I cannot see, despite all the tension in the South China Sea, for example, or over Hong Kong, or maybe trade issues, that will lead to a war situation. The only exception, as far as I can judge, is Taiwan. Here, Taiwan is dangerous. And China, as you know better than I, has a special fondness for Taiwan, believes Taiwan is part of its nation, is of its fatherland, and it's particularly sensitive about Taiwan. So if any official formal declaration of independence was made by the Taiwanese government, that of course could lead to something which could result in military conflict. The question always is, would the United States support Taiwan if such a declaration of independence was made? We don't know. As you know, there's a defense treaty between Taiwan and the United States, and the United States is obligated to come to the help of Taiwan. It doesn't quite precisely say how the United States should help Taiwan. Should it give military goods? Should it even provide soldiers? Should it provide missiles? Should it fight alongside the Taiwanese? That is all left vague and is not specified. I think it depends on how Taiwan would declare independence. If Taiwan declared independence unilaterally and that led to conflict with China, then the United States may say, this is unreasonable what the Taiwanese did. That is actually Taiwan's fault. And we cannot then, in such a scenario, we cannot come to the aid of Taiwan. If, however, China embarked on aggressive action against Taiwan without Taiwan having provoked China by, for example, the declaration of independence, then the United States may actually feel that they have to come to the aid of Taiwan. And of course, that is speculation. We don't know for sure. But one thing is sure, I think, that Taiwan is in my view, only possible issue where a great power conflict between China and the United States might be possible. But even Taiwan, I think, is a remote possibility. So on the whole, I'm quite optimistic that real military conflict between China and the United States is not on the cards. Recently, we had that book published 2 years ago by Graham Allison about the Thucydides trap, and he basically was pessimistic and believed that eventually a big power war between Beijing and Washington would be almost unavoidable. I do not share that pessimism, and I believe leaders both in Beijing and also in Washington are too sensible to go down that course, because everyone knows ultimately it would be a war fought with nuclear weapons. And do we really want to wipe ourselves out? I don't think that a President Trump or President Biden or President Xi Jinping would even dream of doing so. The main characteristics of the West-China policy since the 1970s have actually been very positive. It was President Nixon and Henry Kissinger who went to China and started on diplomatic relations. Actually, official diplomatic relations only occurred under the Carter administration in the late 1970s. But the opening to China, the feelers, and the first trip by an American president to China was, of course, done by Richard Nixon. And I know Henry Kissinger is still held in very high esteem in China, and he still travels regularly to China. So in the 1970s, in the 1980s, also in the 1990s, Western countries, the United States, and with it, most European countries were actually highly interested in good relations with China. They supported the so-called opening to China, the development of China, the build-up of the American economy. You know, there also was Tiananmen Square in 1989, but even that setback was quickly overcome. And in the 1990s, American-Chinese, European-Chinese relations were actually pretty good. So that, and also maybe from a European point of view, I would like to add that the Europeans and also the Americans always have had a fascination with the Chinese people, with the Far East, with the magic of China, the magic of that far away country and its culture and its language, of course. And so there has been, you know, a lot of interest in China throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And in 2001, China was given the green light to join the World Trade Organization. And that was the point when China became more of an economic rival rather than just a minor trading partner. And from that point on, relations between China and the Western world, and particularly the United States, began to deteriorate. At first, only a little bit, and then, of course, increasingly so until it is very fraught with tension right now. But I think the example of the 1980s and 1990s shows us that there is no animosity towards China and the Chinese people as such in Western countries. What it is really driven by is governments. And currently, of course, many European governments and also the American government have become highly critical of China. But I think we should not mix that up with being critical of the Chinese people or suddenly being not liking the Chinese people, being antagonistic against China or its culture, its language, its travel opportunities, its immense countryside and in immense cities. I don't think it has got anything to do with that. There's still a lot of fondness for China regarding the ordinary Chinese people and the country as such. What we see is really a great power struggle between governments. And we should keep that in mind, that it is politicians, that it is governments. It is not the people of America, it is not the people of Europe or the people of China who don't like each other anymore. I think there still is a lot of mutual fascination. Trump, as you know, has had, since he came to office already in 2016, he was very negative on China during the election campaign of 2016. Then he quickly, once he became president, reversed course and became actually quite friendly with and toward Xi Jinping. Remember that big visit by President Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago in Florida, I think in February, March 2017, so early on in Trump's presidency. And they seemed to hit it off. They, talked very well. And the reason why was actually that Trump needed Xi Jinping for his envisaged North Korea policy. He still already had doubts about China's trade relations and economic relations with the United States, but he put that aside because he wanted to use China or Xi Jinping's government to put pressure on North Korea to do something about its nuclear missile development. Only when that did not work, and then Trump, of course, had several visits himself, or I should rather say several meetings with Kim Jong-un. And only when that didn't work, that China did not put as much pressure on Kim as Trump wanted them to do. And secondly, the Chinese pressure didn't really move Kim to give up its nuclear weapons. Only when that didn't work in 2018, Trump became increasingly critical of China because of trade relations. First of all, there still is the huge trade deficit in goods with China. Which has gone up even under Trump, which Trump wanted to scale it down, but it has hardly been scaled down, has scaled down a little bit now because of the pandemic, where trade relations have suffered, of course. Also last year, it went down a little bit, but not to any significant extent. And the United States fears the competition of China in technological terms, in economic terms, in trade terms, and particularly, of course, in the knowledge industry, computer chips. Then, of course, there are also the robotics industry. And then there, of course, are national security concerns that China, so the Trump administration claims, is spying on every American and is really trying to report immediately back to China whatever they find out in the United States. So there's a huge anxiety among the government about the role of China in America's domestic affairs. This, of course, reminds us of the McCarthy era of the 1950s. In the 1950s, Senator McCarthy saw communists, meaning Soviet, Russian communists, everywhere. And he suspected that the whole State Department, the American army, was full of hidden communists who were really working on behalf of the Soviet Union secretly. And that, of course, was a huge exaggeration. And eventually, in the mid-1950s, McCarthy really collapsed, his arguments collapsed, and America became more sober again and less anti-communist, or that paranoia about communists everywhere calmed down again. And something similar is happening now. Of course, we have to admit to ourselves there are Chinese spies in America. But this is a tiny percentage. There are also, of course, American spies in China. There are German spies, both in the United States and in China, I would assume, and British spies in particular, and French spies. That is the nature of international relations. But it is not true, of course, that everywhere in the United States there are Chinese or German or British spies or Russian spies. There are some, clearly, but not as widespread as the administration wants to make us believe. And that in particular, of course, refers also to scholars and scientists and students. Undoubtedly, there are some, a few, but there are some scholars, scientists, students who have been recruited by the Chinese Secret Service, clearly. But this is a tiny minority. And we should not get totally paranoid about the situation as we did in the 1950s. So that, I hope, will change once, once people think about the whole situation in a more sober way. Under if President Trump is re-elected, we can assume that China will remain the bogeyman. He has built up China so much as a bogeyman and as that evil country, he will not just be able to turn around and say, sorry, made a mistake, China is really lovely. That will be very difficult to do. So if essentially his anti-Chinese policy, he will have to continue in order to save his own face. What can we expect under President Biden? Also, Joe Biden has been quite critical of China about various issues, which I will mention in a minute. But I believe that a Biden administration, because it is a new administration, it doesn't have to continue anything. It could go back to basis. It could start all over again. Of course, it would be skeptical. It would be suspicious. But there would be less of a baggage. They could say, let's meet at the negotiation table again. Let's pick up on dialogue again, be it technological dialogue, be it diplomatic dialogue, be it trade relation dialogue, be it a dialogue on how to reduce tariffs again on agricultural goods. And I think that is what we probably would see, that the Biden administration would also be skeptical and very critical of China, but they would also try to enter into a dialogue again. And frankly, I can't see that a new Trump administration will be able to embark on a new dialogue with China, because there's so much bad blood has already happened, and so many relationships have been spoiled, and so many dialogues have been broken off. I think it would be extremely difficult for a second Trump administration to suddenly become more constructive toward China. So in a way, it's easier for a new government, be it a Democratic or, let's say, if there were a totally new Republican president, I think it would be easier for a new leader to actually be more constructive towards China in the future. What are the issues about China? And of course, as we all know, there are human rights problems, and the Europeans and the Americans see them very seriously. I think there is actually a different perspective at play. I do think that the Chinese government sees events in Hong Kong, Tibet, Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang as simply less important and less significant than the Europeans and the Americans do. And I think here a lot of dialogue could help to overcome that and perhaps do something about that critical situation. But the solution is diplomacy. We need to attack that by means of diplomacy, and maybe understand each other's very different perception on human rights in these areas which I've just mentioned. Then there are various geopolitical problems. I mentioned the South China Sea. There's Taiwan. There's also fierce competition happening in the Arctic. There are many oil resources, many natural resources, including oil and gas, deep down in the sea under the Arctic, which has led to fierce competition between not just China and the United States, but also Scandinavian countries, for example. And there's also fierce geopolitical competition going on in Africa and the wider Indo-Pacific region, and as it has been called by Trump in 2017. And then, of course, there's economic and trade rivalry, which has led recently to that fierce trade war. And here, what is the issue in that trade war? It is above all the demand for reciprocity in market access and investments. Also here, people differ how they perceive the problem. China, for example, still says we are still a developing country, while most countries in the West say you are not a developing country anymore. You have become an industrialized, developed country. And there is a serious misunderstanding and misperception on both sides happening here, which could be resolved by further negotiations, by further clarification, I believe. Also, of course, we have the intellectual property problem. So that is gradually being resolved because China now also wants to protect its intellectual property, as it has developed so much intellectual property in its own right and doesn't want to have that stolen by anyone, be it Vietnam or be it Western countries. So I think the intellectual property angle will actually be resolved pretty soon, as China itself has an interest in resolving it. And then there are issues such as journalistic and diplomatic freedoms in both sides. Now, diplomats have been curtailed to travel to university campuses in the United States. Then China has imposed similar restrictions on Western diplomats. Also, journalists have been restricted to work. And that has then always resulted in a tit for tat. And that doesn't get us anywhere. And that needs to be talked about seriously. Also, of course, travel freedoms need to be reinstituted. That has less to do with politics and more to do with the pandemic. But personally, I would love to travel back to China again, and the pandemic doesn't allow me to get in without, however, having to quarantine for 14 days, which is not a nice prospect. To, defeats the purpose of traveling to China if you first have to spend 2 weeks in a hotel room and can't get out. Most people want to do some sightseeing, want to talk to people rather than being in a hotel room stuck for 2 weeks. What is the best way forward? I think the best way forward is twofold. First, it is dialogue on all areas, political, economic, cultural, including student and scholar exchanges. That is, of course, a very active dialogue. If people get to know the other country, they totally understand the other country better, and they are not even thinking of becoming hostile to that country they've got to know and they've visited. So I think dialogue on all areas, in the political area, the economic era, and the very private field, as well as cultural dialogue, is highly important. Secondly, of course, the United States and the Europeans shouldn't just complain about China becoming rather good at developing high-tech technology and sophisticated robotics industries and sophisticated battery-driven cars and so on and so on. They should not just complain that China is catching up and perhaps becoming even better than the Western countries, but they should try to develop the West more themselves. They should reinvest into Western industries, into Western sophisticated technology to make sure that China cannot overtake them. So it is really a peaceful competition between scholars, between industries, and between investors. And I think here the United States really has also to look at its own country, and it shouldn't just complain about competition from abroad, whether it's China or Europe or other countries or India or other countries, but it should also say, what have we done to basically fall back? Why haven't we invested more? What about, again, the 1960s? In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union sent the first man into space. That was Sputnik. And that shocked the American establishment so much that it wasn't the United States, but the Soviet Union, which put a man into space. And President Eisenhower and then President Kennedy immediately embarked on a huge investment crusade in the United States. They really put a lot of money and energy into all sorts of industries, all sorts of scientific endeavors to make sure the United States would catch up again. And that, of course, led in 1969 to the landing of the first man on the moon, who was an American. And I think the same investment drives, the same energy, the same creative energy the United States needs to find and needs to put into its own country than it did in the 1960s. And here, of course, competition is healthy. If other countries like China become rather good at knowledge industries, the United States should be driven to be better and to invest. And that sort of competition, peaceful, industrial, knowledge competition, I think there's nothing wrong with that if both sides compete in a fair and equal way. And I think that hopefully is the future of Chinese-American relations, that there will be good competition, but peaceful, scientific, innovative competition. And there's nothing wrong with that. But that means both nations can also live in peace and stability with each other, and that no one will jump at each other's throat. So hopefully the coming American presidential election will clarify the situation. And hopefully that means we will also embark on a new era in American-Chinese, and also, I would hope, European-American-Chinese relations. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was one of the most enlightening presentations I've heard in a long time.
That's
and
so good.
Certainly, I think people now know that you're not quite an opinionated guy, I guess. but it was very nice to hear the positive and kind words. We have a few questions that have come up. I don't know whether you could see them on the screen, but
no, if you would read them to me, yeah.
Okay. This is from Rick to everyone, and I think you answered this, but maybe you want to elaborate on it a little bit further. It says, you mentioned in your presentation that people now think China is bad now. Can you please comment on this type of thinking? Is it really because of the media, or if common American people really think that is what's going on?
No, as I tried to make sure, I think people in the West differentiate a lot between the Chinese government and the Chinese people. And I think there are very few people, maybe highly unsophisticated people, but not anyone who is a little bit more thinking, a little bit more thoughtful, thinks the Chinese people are bad. I've never heard that. That there is serious doubt about the Chinese government and some of the policies of the Chinese government, this is correct. And that is not totally wrong. Let me give you an example. Take Hong Kong. You know, we had a 50-year treaty with Britain, and that treaty has not been upheld. You know, a national security law has been introduced, which of course gives the Chinese government a lot of rights in Hong Kong. That, from a Western point of view, ran counter to the Anglo-Sino Treaty of the late 1980s, 1987 actually. And they believe the Chinese government did something wrong. No one accuses the Chinese people of having done anything wrong. We don't know whether the Chinese people actually like that policy or whether they don't like the Hong Kong policy of the Beijing government. So I think one needs to differentiate clearly between the Chinese people and the government. And I think the same applies the other way around. I can fully understand that many Chinese government officials are very critical of the Trump administration. But I'm sure people in Wuhan, for example, or in Shanghai or in other cities will probably not blame the American people for all of Trump's trade war actions. You know, the American people in Chapel Hill or in Washington or in Iowa, they are totally innocent about the trade war, and they probably don't sympathize with the trade war at all. For example, the farmers in Iowa are very critical of the trade war Trump has unleashed. So I think we should blame governments. We should look for faults and criticism of both governments, but we shouldn't start blaming the Chinese people or the American people. The majority of the Chinese and American people actually do not know that much about politics between China and the United States.
Thank you very much. We have several other questions here lined up. This one, some people believe Trump is just using China to help his reelection. If so, will he stop attacking China and instead work with the Chinese and continue the trade deal to improve the relations after he's elected?
To some extent, perhaps yes. Of course he uses China, but Trump, as you know, is on the losing side. At least that is what the opinion polls tell us. He probably feels on the defensive. So he will use any argument, be it regarding China, be it regarding anything else, if it helps him to win the election. So that is, in a way, sad, but typical for a politician. I'm sure if a Democrat was losing or be on the losing side, they would also try to find arguments they can use to increase their popularity. And Trump is clearly using China, but it goes beyond that. You know, he already blamed China in 2016. He unleashed the trade war with China in 2018. So that is not connected to his re-election, that he is now becoming even more critical than in 2018 and 2019 towards China. That may have something to do with the election. But I think he genuinely believes that China is responsible for many of the economic problems of the United States by trading in an unfair way. And he has repeatedly said that. I think, thousands and thousands of times he has said that and said that in speeches. And I do think that he believes that. That doesn't mean that after election, if he won it, he would perhaps try to overcome that again. But it would be very difficult for him. And, who in China, who in Beijing would really trust him? If he got re-elected and suddenly he said, oh, I'm sorry, I just made silly remarks because of the election, would you believe him? You would still continue to be highly suspicious of him. And I think he has a lot of baggage, particularly regarding China, but also regarding other issues, for example, as I said, regarding the Europeans and NATO. And someone like President Biden, who actually knows Xi Jinping very well, Biden actually said they've had 15 meetings in the past when he was vice president. I think someone like Biden has probably a better chance to restart relations with China than someone like Trump, who has been constantly very negative about China for the last 3.5 years or longer.
Thank you. What do you think of the WeChat ban and the attack on TikTok?
Yeah, that's a bit silly. Yeah. I use WeChat myself, so I would be very sad if suddenly I could not use WeChat, but I can assure you, as you have found out, it still works. I'm not sure whether we can still download it, but if you have it already, it still works. Doesn't seem to be a problem. But let me say one point. We all know the Chinese government listens in. So if you say something really critical about the Chinese government, let's say about personalities in China, or give away state secrets via WeChat, you will be quickly found out. That is also the reason why most of us probably only talk about, let's meet tomorrow for coffee. How's your aunt doing? How's the baby doing? And then, of course, the Chinese government is not particularly interested how your baby is doing. So that is, and I think to ban WeChat because there is a national security suspicion. So everyone who uses WeChat also knows that really secret things you do not talk about on WeChat. You only use it for small talk, for relatively innocent things. Then it's pretty safe. So and I think the American government uses it in a too dramatic way. They should perhaps have warned American WeChat users that the Chinese government may listen in, particularly if you use certain words. Let's say if you constantly talk about Xinjiang, then I'm sure the Chinese government will check what you actually said. But if you do not do that, use it for these everyday communication ways, then I'm sure the Chinese government hasn't got a particular interest in your conversations. And I think that would have been a much better way to enlighten the people that WeChat could be dangerous for your own personal security if you go into certain topics, but not on others. Banning it like a blanket ban, suspecting everyone essentially to be spied upon or even contributing to the spy, I think is way over the top. And of course, as always with technology, people find ways around it. In China, they have banned Google and Facebook and Twitter, but people use VPN and still access China, Facebook and Twitter and Google and so on. So if they find a way around it in China, I'm sure American users can also find a way around it in the United States. So it's, I think, a little bit over the top.
Okay. One other question from Sarah just popped up. What is your opinion on American corporations doing business in China? Would the Biden administration be different in this regard?
Both the Americans and the Europeans increasingly, particularly since 2016, insist on reciprocity. That means a Western market is pretty open. If a Chinese company wants to set up a factory or wants to invest in an American company, they usually can do that without constrictions unless it's national security, if it's military related. That's a different matter. But if it's a private company dealing with just non-military, non-national security technologies, usually they are not prohibited from investing in all sorts of companies, including the media, including financial services, including the pharmaceutical industry. This is not the other way around. If, let's say, the BBC wanted to set up a studio in Beijing, the BBC for broadcasting inside China, that would not be allowed. But vice versa, of course, that is allowed. And the same applies to financial services, pharmaceutical industries, and media in particular. And what American and European governments want is the same level playing field. And it has become better, one has to say that. You know, the Chinese government has been put under a lot of pressure and has gradually opened up more industries like financial services, for example, to investment by European and American or foreign companies. But it has not gone far enough. And many Europeans, also Americans, complain about a so-called promise fatigue. The Chinese government has promised for many, many years to open up its market more. It has not really happened, only a little bit. And so a lot of people are becoming impatient. Said, how long are we going to wait? 10 years, another 20 years, 30 years? And that, I think, is the problem. That reciprocity, that equal playing field on both sides is not there. And that needs to be achieved. Once that is there, then I think it's really fair competition. And of course, another problem regarding China from a European and American point of view is the state-run companies. And they are being strengthened in China. And they are being given particular subsidies. And private European American companies find it very difficult to compete with these subsidized huge state companies. And that is another bone of contention. And the Trump administration, the Obama administration, many European governments, particularly Angela Merkel's government in Germany, have always complained about the unfair advantage given to state-run, huge subsidized Chinese companies, where a private company in the West simply cannot compete with. And that needs to be addressed, I think. And these are long-standing problems which can best be overcome by means of negotiations. I could say something about the investment treaty, but that might be too special between Europe and China.
That's interesting because as a businessman, I live these things every day, not to that giant extent like Huawei and things like that, but I feel it.
Yeah. No, for example, just a brief word. The Europeans and the Chinese are in the middle of negotiating an investment treaty that has been actually negotiated since 2013. So 7 years. You can imagine how difficult these negotiations must have been, otherwise they would have been finished. And they hope now to sign it by the end of this year. But that is the official hope. In private, businessmen say, no way. And the reason why is the Europeans say the market needs to be open, more open. There must be a level, fair playing field. Otherwise, we are not signing an investment treaty. An investment treaty would make investments easier for both China and the Europeans. And the bone of contention is that level playing field. And subsidized state-run companies in China are a big problem. But so far they're talking, and I think that's good. They're talking and negotiating a lot, but they haven't managed to overcome their mutual different perceptions, different understanding of the issue. Maybe I'm wrong, and there will be an investment treaty by the end of the year. I think it will take another year or two, and even then we don't know. So both sides need to give way. That is the nicety of negotiations is you have to compromise. You can never get 100% of your point of view through. And how and where to compromise, I think that is what the Chinese and the Europeans are busily doing right now while we speak.
Well, that sounds like good news. It looks like that was the last question. We'll give it a minute to, we'll give it one more here. Sure. Is it possible that Trump will blame China if he loses the election and impose more measures against China before he leaves office in January?
Well, of course, you can never say no, but I think that is probably not the greatest danger. There's only 2 months before Trump would have to leave office. And of course, he could increase tariffs for 2 months, but then they could be easily reversed by the next president, in this case, Joe Biden. Of course, you say there might be military conflict, but I don't think that Trump would embark on military conflict because he loses the election. So I think that is, it may happen to some extent in economic terms, but I don't think that is a severe problem because, it's only 2 months. It can easily be reversed by the next president. And of course, what you also see is China, Beijing recognizes that it's a particularly volatile period now. So I think the Chinese would be particularly restrained and keep, they really keep a calm attitude because they know it's a especially volatile. They would not allow themselves to be easily provoked by, some action like that. So I hope that sane minds will succeed on both sides.
Well, that was a wonderful presentation, and
thank you.
There's kind of an elephant in the room called India, and I would like to congratulate you on being named Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Indian Institute of Technology. And I'm really looking forward to the next speech on India, because India is certainly an emerging power and an emerging presence in the global political network. And I'm really looking forward to see what you learn in that position.
Okay, thank you. Exciting. Happy to be back. Thank you very much.
And we've already seen that you're a distinguished visiting professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and we just saw the results of that. One quick question just popped up here from Zhao Wei, and Zhao Wei is a personal friend of mine, so we have to take it. And I think you hit on this, but you may want to summarize. Do you have any suggestions about how to improve the China-U.S. relationships on the China side?
Yeah, I do, because all the issues I just mentioned, the economic trade issues, and also the South China Sea, the geopolitical issues, and the human rights issue, I really think the ball is in China's court. While you cannot expect that China just turns around and says, yes, we were wrong, you were right, and just gives up everything they've stood for. Of course not. But they can make concessions and they can make compromises. And President Xi Jinping has proven to be a very strong president. And a strong president has the advantage that he can make concessions without being hounded from office. And an example would be, for example, President Nixon in the 1970s. Nixon had a very strong anti-communist reputation. He made his reputation as a strong anti-communist hater, you can also almost say. And he still realized in the late 60s that China is a country which is up and coming. He realized we need to have better relations with China. So China was, of course, even more so than today, a very hardline communist country under Chairman Mao. That was not a soft democratic country. That was a hardline communist country. So normally you would have said President Nixon would have hated Mao's China. He would not have dared to touch it. But because of his strong reputation as an anti-communist, he could actually go to China and talk to Mao and his government, because no one could accuse Nixon of selling out the United States, of not being hardline and anti-communist enough. So because he was a strong foreign policy leader, Nixon could make concessions. He could talk to the communist arch enemy. And I think that applies to any strong leader. If you have a strong leader in China, like President Xi Jinping is, he can actually make concessions without the Chinese people losing faith in him. He can still continue to be a strong president. He could make concessions, for example, in that investment treaty, which I just mentioned, in market access issues. He could also go back a little bit in the South China Sea and be a little bit more restrained. Also, he doesn't need to have maneuvers just outside Taiwan. You know, that could be cancelled or could be notched down a little bit. And no one would think President Xi Jinping was suddenly not strong anymore. He would still be strong, and he could afford to do that. And I think that is the advantage of a strong leader, that he can make reasonable concessions and also reflect on the situation and how to prevent things. And of course, even more so in Xinjiang. You know, is it really necessary to have these re-education camps, the so-called re-education camps in Xinjiang? You know, people in Xinjiang don't actually want to separate from China. Terrorism in Xinjiang is not very strong. Do these camps really need to stay in existence, even be expanded, as I recently read? Shouldn't they gradually be dissolved? Shouldn't the inmates in these camps be reintegrated into normal Xinjiang society? Would that bring down China? Would that be the end of China or Xi Jinping's government? I don't think so. He would actually increase his image abroad. If he did something like that, his image as a leader in the United States and in Europe and worldwide would be immensely strengthened. And I don't think he would suffer in China either. Probably a lot of Chinese would also respect that sort of reasonableness to deal with Xinjiang, because at the moment it's totally going out of control and is being so hardline, which is very difficult to stomach for anyone outside China. And that is a problem between the West and China. It's a human rights situation, you know.
Yeah, some of these questions you've answered fully already, and I apologize to the people who are writing them. But you know, do you think Trump will launch a war against China to win the election? I think you've covered that pretty fully, and I don't want to put you through that again. Can you comment on the USA's policy on Huawei? And not only the US policy, but it seems increasingly the European Union is jumping in against Huawei. What do you think of that? Is it justified?
It's difficult to say. I'm not a technical expert to really know. Some reports, independent of European and American governments, say that there are loopholes in Huawei's technology which could be exploited by the government, or first by Huawei as a company, and then if the Chinese government asks them to hand it over indirectly by the government. I don't know if this is correct. When I follow these reports, they sound persuasive. There is a weakness in the technology. If that is correct, I understand that to be on the safe side, that the American and European governments don't want to run that risk. That doesn't mean that Huawei is doing that right now or will do next week. But if they fear it might be down the road in 5 years' time, then of course you want to exclude that potential possibility. Even if it never really happens, even the potential possibility you would like to rule out. And so from that point of view, I understand that. When you go to China, you know, would the Chinese government use Samsung or Nokia or IBM if they believed it would make some of China's high-tech technology or the personal data of Chinese people tempted to be to be handed over to the American government. They probably would also not to do that. You know, the Chinese doesn't want to give the American CIA any information about its own citizens. And, you know, the Europeans and the Americans don't want to give the Chinese Secret Service information about their own citizens or their own telecommunications network. So I think both sides wouldn't like to do that. I can't judge whether Huawei is really vulnerable to doing that, you know, if the technology is vulnerable or not. It really depends on the expertise of experts who can tell us whether or not that is the case.